People have been enjoying sexual experiences and expressing themselves in non-binary forms since the beginning of time. There are several popular examples that anthropologists provide, such as the Greeks' conception uh, of gay sex being a higher form of love, as well as two-spirited people in indigenous communities who hold both feminine and masculine identities in the same body. But the construction of a social identity around queerness is a relatively new phenomenon. Industrial capital included material conditions which allowed for the exploration and development of individual identities. At the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, an entire subculture began to develop around queer identities, a culture that was largely unseen and unspoken in public discourse due to state as well as social repression or cultural repression, rather. Not until post-World War II do we see a qualitative jump in the public expression of queer identities and culture. What could have caused that, you might be asking? What does war and some homosexuality have in common? Well, not a whole lot, unless you count class war and queer liberation, then they have a whole hell of a lot in common. But post-World War II America is less about the violence of bourgeois war and more about the set of homosocial production relations that a mass of the population entered into and didn't want to leave. Whether it be in the European front, men being sent off to war, or in military production factories, where primarily women were doing the production, coupled with the intense emotional atmosphere, these new social relations allowed for the expression of formerly repressed queer identities and the desires that come with them on a massive scale. This period of massive shift in the social demographic was directly followed by the second Red Scare of McCarthyism in the 1950s. Not only were leftist organizations and individuals targeted, but anyone deemed dissentious was seen as a potential agent for Soviet espionage. Someone could very easily lose their job, professional license, family, be lobotomized, or face life in prison for expressing a queer identity. Early 1950s sees the Mattachine Society established as the first openly gay rights political organization by Henry Hay, a communist and labor rights activist. In its early years, the society did a lot of great work organizing grassroots gay rights campaigns and grew to have chapters across the country with thousands of members, but never quite achieved a status of mass orientation and remained largely underground. Again, due to state repression. By 1955, Hay and others had been pushed out of the organization, and Mattachine took a hard right turn, even claiming that homosexuality was a mental disorder in need of treatment. Which, holy fuck, is that a rightward turn? The first openly lesbian organization began in 1955 with the Daughters of Bilitis in San Francisco. They published the first lesbian magazine called The Ladder, but remained a self-help organization, once again, due to McCarthyism fears of crackdown, repression, incarceration. Homophile activism remains relatively quiet until the mid-60s, when the civil rights movement builds steam against Jim Crow racism. Inspired by the bravery of the civil rights movement, standing up to police brutality and harsh repression, the Mattachine rank and file members push for more militancy from their fucked up leadership, who at this point are literally suggesting members seek psychiatric help for homosexual desires. Like, goddamn, if that isn't bad leadership. The homophile movement takes notice of the fight for civil rights for Black people and begins utilizing the tool set of class warfare. Sit-ins, pickets, boycotts, mass protests begin to find a place in the struggle for gay rights. Not only in tactics, but also in consciousness. Seeing the struggle against police brutality and racist bigotry emboldened the young gay rights movement to fight back, to stand together, that a better world was possible. During the mid-1960s, the gay rights movement was smaller than other mass movements, largely due to repression and harsh punishments for being outed. The Compton Cafeteria riot in San Francisco was a precursor to the Stonewall Rebellion, when a trans woman, fed up with being harassed by the cops, threw a cup of coffee in a cop's face, sparking a riot and days of picketing outside the cafeteria. As the 1960s was coming to a close, America was experiencing the largest social upheaval and political radicalization since the 1930s. The kettle of class unrest was singing a very sharp tune, and then Stonewall happens. In the early morning of June 28th, 1969, cops conduct a raid that was for the most part business as usual. The Stonewall Inn was a grimy little home to the gay community of Greenwich, featuring the only gay dance floor in New York and was steps away from the Village Voice, the largest independent weekly publication. Gay bars were popularly run by the mafia due to inherent illegality of being a gay bar, but in no way was the mafia allies of the community. They openly despised gay people and aided their harassment and arrest. The routine raids at bars like the Stonewall usually took place in the evening so as not to disrupt the cash flow of the mob. The night of June 24th, cops were given explicit instructions to shut the Stonewall down. The 24th. The crowd was dispersed with money and booze confiscated and cops threatening return to put an end to the Stonewall finally. The cops returned on the 29th for an oddly late raid with even more brutality than normal. They were in for a surprise when the crowd didn't merely disperse after being kicked out, but held their ground and began yelling, jeering at the cops. Tonight would be different. A few dozen quickly swelled to a few hundred, then a few thousand. The uprising was multiracial, diverse, and reflected a broad spectrum of the LGBTQ community. Many eyewitnesses comment specifically on the important role played that night by the most marginalized sections of the community, the street kids, trans women, and queer youth of color. But when the paddy wagons arrived, the mood changed drastically. Angry onlookers began throwing coins at police and then moved on to bottles, cobblestones, and trash cans. A full-fledged riot soon broke out. Later that night, the riot squad arrived, and a night-long chase between gay and trans protesters and police ensued. Expecting to easily disperse a crowd of people that society had labeled sissies and faggots and stereotyped as weak, the police were caught completely off guard when the protesters fought back. Pioneering transgender activist Sylvia Rivera was part of the Friday night uprising, which she would later describe as a turning point in her life. When a friend tried to convince her to leave, she said, "Are you nuts? I'm not missing a minute of this. It's the revolution." What followed this week of rioting was nothing short of revolutionary. Mobilizations and organizing went into full swing. Leaflets with the slogan, "Do you think homosexuals are revolting? You bet your sweet ass we are," littered every corner. The Mattachine Society was contacted for an organizing meeting, but older conservative members of the society feared disrupting their cozy relationship with established politicians by being associated with the bad protesters. We've seen that before. The rioting activists called an organizing meeting anyways. 40 activists took the name Gay Liberation Front in honor of the Viet Cong of the NLF fighting American imperialism in Vietnam, the National Liberation Front, which is the Viet Cong. When asked what made them revolutionaries, they replied, "We identify ourselves with all the oppressed, the Vietnamese struggle, the third world, the blacks, the workers, all those oppressed by this rotten, dirty, vile, fucked up capitalist conspiracy." Class consciousness was erupting. Post-Stonewall witnesses a shift from gay rights to gay liberation, almost overnight. The GLF split of the orientation of a single issue organization, or taking the GLF split over the orientation of being a single issue organization or taking up the project of total human liberation in the tradition of socialism. I couldn't find good wording for that sentence. The GAA put out a definitive statement that their project was exclusively devoted to the liberation of homosexuals and avoids involvement in any program of action not obviously related to homosexuals, which is not to say that they were betrothed to the homophile establishment, not wanting to rock the boat. They were every bit as militant in their tactics as the GLF and worked in coalition, almost constant coalition, to organize mass demonstrations and marches. Both organizations focused on the importance of coming out. Not only did this affirm and inspire queer people everywhere to be their true selves, but it also created an almost limitless supply of recruits being radicalized in the moment. Despite the great strides forward that the gay rights movement took, it would be almost 30 years before there was widespread acceptance of their trans siblings in the movement. Ranging from dismissal to outright hostility, trans people were largely excluded from gay rights activism until at least the early 2000s. This is something that I think has been empirically corrected in the queer liberation movement we witness today. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were often unwelcome, but they didn't let this sway them from fighting for their own liberation. They remained dedicated. Oh, shit. Sorry, I lost my spot. I hit a button. No, I lost my spot. They remained dedicated fighters of the GLF, despite the bad politics from the front that didn't value their own lives appropriately. An example we can all learn from. This is a major misstep of the gay rights movement to not include the demands and consideration of their trans siblings. The slogan of "no one is free until we are all free" are not just empty words. They are a necessary tactic to achieve victory. If Stonewall teaches us anything, it's that riots fucking work. This statement isn't an opinion. It isn't a preference that I have. It is a historic fact. When we fight, we win. Mass uprisings will create more change in a matter of days or weeks than an electoral campaign can accomplish in years. That's a fact. Uprisings aren't always on the table, but uprisings aren't always on the table. The masses aren't always ready for all-out rebellion. So what do we do in the meantime? We educate and train the masses away from psychotic electoral cycle having anything to offer working class people. We must argue for drawing appropriate conclusions from our political experiences. The generalization of ideas does not arise spontaneously. A conscious intervention of dedicated revolutionaries is required to synthesize experience into a framework of class-conscious growth. This task is always on the table. It is always pressing. When mass uprisings aren't there, we prepare for when they are. Another unique aspect of Stonewall that created a sharp turn for the gay rights movement was the organizational expression directly following the riot. The birth of the GLF and the GAA and their outright rejection of the sharp conservatism of the Mattachine Society were the kinds of strategic organizing decisions that are necessary for a riot to turn into a movement. Outbursts are the end of pacification and acceptance, but a necessary beginning of a journey to liberation. Revolutionaries never know when or where they might happen, but our organizational preparedness is necessary for when those ruptures do occur, and we know they will. Solidarity and the interconnectedness of struggle is another key takeaway from Stonewall. There must be an analysis of interconnection between every aspect represented during the riot. Police brutality is a gay rights issue. Incarceration is a gay rights issue. Trans liberation, a gay rights issue. All of these struggles are interconnected and depend on one another to deepen and further their own issues. Fast forwarding all the way to today, we can see that the queer rights movement is once again on the defensive. With over 500 anti-trans bill passed in the states over the past 2 years, we have witnessed an onslaught against the basic human rights of our trans siblings. Even still, we see moments of hope and optimism as the working class formulates a response to this oppression. From the ongoing strikes at the University of Michigan that specifically include language around LGBTQ protections and their demands, and the writers' strike holding pickets specifically themed around transgender and gender nonconforming visibility within the Writers Guild and the industry more broadly, we are fighting back. Let us do them honor is the eloquent line that Enid from Left Voice opens with their article that we read for tonight. Honor isn't a word that I use a lot or find a lot of use for. It feels too laden with masculine, patriarchal baggage that the meaning kind of gets lost. But Enid's expression rings in my ears anytime I sit down to write one of these presentations that I feel so inadequate to give. My efforts seem so tiny when placed in scope with the heroism of Stonewall or any other movement that we study, learn from, and are inspired by. I suppose they might always feel that way. I know this isn't the most materialist of closes, but if we have to live our lives with a set of values, if we are in fact abstract beings, then I'd like my values to be that which bring honor to those who came before me and those who come after me, to bring honor to the thousands of trans siblings who have dedicated their lives to the liberation of humanity. I hope I do them honor in my contribution to a lineage of revolutionaries satisfied with nothing less than the abolition of oppression for all people. Thank you.